Okay, hello everyone. We're going to get started for Leah's second presentation. So if everyone just wants to take a seat, get settled for Leah's second presentation. So just rules again for those online. Please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. It's very distracting for the presenter if there is feedback noise, and if your camera's on, it's also distracting. So please just mute and camera off. And so I will turn it over to Leah for her second talk, which I understand is about prayer and about a conversion of the heart. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you all had a good lunch. As you may be able to tell, I'm now in the basement of my house because my daughters are having lunch upstairs, and I assume, however kind of convivial and raucous your lunch was for the retreat, theirs is louder, so I'm down here for now. What I really want to talk about is that in my first talk, I talked about how God invited me to know that he was, but deciding to convert, deciding to become Catholic, didn't answer or didn't fully respond to the longings of my heart, because it wasn't enough just to know that God was. I wanted to know him in friendship. And I knew that I was less prepared to do that than to just explore the intellectual questions of what are the proofs for God, what kind of philosophy should I follow, etc. To some extent, the entire first talk I gave you this morning was much more like if you told the story of the Narnia, but only up to the discovery of the wardrobe, and then just got very into the details of the wardrobe, what kind of handle it had, exactly how deep it was before she felt snow, but stopped the story before Narnia actually emerged. Because coming to conversion, it's only the opening of the door, and it's living as a Christian, what you're all doing, what I'm doing now, that is the heart of our conversion, day by day, moment to moment, living in friendship with Christ. So for me, becoming a Christian was much harder than deciding to become a Christian. And in large part, that was because growing up as an atheist, I hadn't left any room for God. It's different for my husband, who came into the Catholic Church from growing up as an Anglican, where he'd always had a friendship with God, and then that friendship took on a different nature and deepened as he entered the fullness of the Catholic faith. But for me, everything I did in prayer felt like suddenly making a little space in my life for God, when in fact God wanted me to give me his whole life. Early on, even before my conversion, there was a moment when a friend of mine asked me to pray with them, and I was reluctant to, because I didn't believe in God. I didn't want to pray, but most of all, I just didn't feel it was possible, especially from a position of non-belief. So I said, look, I can try this once, but you've got to pray first. You've got to kind of do the dialing of the phone, and then you could hand the phone to me and say, God, Leah is going to talk now, and I could try it from there, but I couldn't start. I don't know where to aim prayer. And my friend thought this was a little ridiculous, but becoming a Christian only took me so far in solving this problem, because now suddenly I had faith that God was on the other line, but I had no habit of speaking with him. I had been for years arguing and reading and thinking about God, while prayer in actuality is the practice of thinking with God. So when I began trying to pray and began trying to learn how to become Catholic, the first prayer I turned to was the Rosary. And there were really two reasons for that. One, it's very simple. It was the most Catholic prayer I knew of. When people think of Catholics, they think of rosaries. So I felt like picking up the rosary definitely meant I was engaging with God in a Catholic way, and I must be on the right track somehow. And the other was that it was a very set prayer. So unlike open-ended, spontaneous prayer, I didn't really have to worry I was doing it wrong. As long as I had the brochure and the beads, I felt like I was probably doing the right thing no matter what. But it was still pretty hard for me, because as I started to get a little facilness with the sequence of prayers, I wasn't having to peek at the brochure all the time. I was kind of confronted with the problem of, what is God asking me to do when he asked me to meditate on the mysteries of his life and on Mary's life? And having this intellectual bent, it was hard to shake the feeling that maybe what I was supposed to do was think so hard about these mysteries that I could solve them in some sense. I know it sounds silly, but I really thought, maybe I can come up with something new to tell God about his life by praying the rosary so hard and so well. And I really struggled, because First of all, it's an impossible task. And that's just not what prayer is. Prayer isn't something that we kind of do as a project separately from God and bring back to Him as a surprise or as a gift. It's again the practice of being with Him. And I had trouble with that, of just dwelling in His presence. And one of the things that helped me most as I was learning to pray different prayers, starting with the rosary, was turning to experiences from my life as an atheist, from the secular parts of my life where I saw beauty or grace, and starting to see God's hand behind them and how they could teach me about developing this greater intimacy with Him in the places He was calling me. So when it came to learning to pray the rosary, one of the things that was most helpful to me was my experience taking ballroom dance lessons. Because most of learning to do ballroom dance is very, very boring. When you see someone at a competition or even at a social dance, they're having a lot of fun. There are swings, there are dips. You might break off, go to a special dance, and then come back together perfectly in time, and then whisk yourself on away down the floor. But in class, we weren't doing that at all. In class, we spent most of our time practicing the basic. So if I were doing the cha-cha, I'd just be going 1, 2, cha-cha-cha, 2, 3, cha-cha-cha, 1, 2, cha-cha-cha, 3, 4, cha-cha-cha, again and again in place, and to the point where I was practicing that basic step in class. I was practicing that basic step on the subway. I was practicing that basic step while waiting for water to boil in the kitchen. The same, very boring, very repetitive step all the time. And the reason was the goal of practicing, the reason we stuck with the basic rather than spending much time on all the things we wanted to do with the basic, is that we wanted to get that basic step into our bones until it felt like a natural way to move. Because as a follow in ballroom dance, it isn't my job to anticipate the next step. As I'm going 1, 2, cha cha cha, I'm not supposed to be thinking, I wonder if we're doing a turn next. I wonder if we're doing a walkout. Because the more I try and anticipate what step will come next, the less prepared I am for whatever step the lead is actually going to choose. The more I'm starting to, set myself up ahead of time, the more I'm setting myself back. The goal is just to move fluidly and in time to the music so that whatever direction I get, I can continue to move as though the cha-cha were as natural as walking, just with the slightest touch, the slightest direction, the smallest cue, and my body will follow. And similarly, the more time I spent with the rosary, the more I could see that the goal wasn't for me to surprise God or to do my own unique work, but just to practice the habit of presence with God, so that at sometimes while praying, there might be a real moment of spiritual consolation or insight. But other moments, it was more like when I was standing in front of the oven, waiting for the water to boil on the stove, and nothing was happening as I cha-cha'd, nothing dramatic, nothing beautiful, just the patient work of making the rhythm part of what my body knew, part of the shape my body took, so that when a touch came, I would be ready to move. And it was hard for me because most of the work I'd done up till that point, especially intellectual work, was work that had more struggle to it and more accomplishment. And it was hard to shake the sense of prayer that kind of patience and silence could be a strong part of my friendship with God. That it wasn't just a matter of doing things for God, but of being content to be with Him. But to some extent, that was the kind of pervasive challenge of learning to pray as an atheist, of less going out to find God all the time, even though I value opportunities to pray at church, to go to adoration, but less the sense of how will I plan to see God? When will I go to see God? And more, God is here. How will I slow myself down and make space and notice what He is already doing before I go chasing after Him in the places where I think of Him as staying separate from where I am? It was very challenging for me. But the more time I spent with it, the easier it was to think about really just letting His work unfold, letting His presence be with me. And one thing that surprised me as I spent more time in prayer and more time looking at what God did was that as I became Catholic, I I had an easier time coming into the church than people who are already baptized. I didn't have to make a life confession in the way that Protestant converts do, where as a very kind of challenging moment, you need to go see a priest and make a confession of all your major sins from the time of the age of reason till now before you're received into the church. But for me, being received at the church was like a baby being received, where I had never been baptized and was unable to do confession until I was received. And all my sins of my life were washed away in that initial baptism. And from there on, I had to develop the habit of confession, the habit of recollection, the attentiveness to sin, and the willingness to bring it to God. And I was so surprised by what confession was because, to some extent, I was generalizing what confession might be from my experience of making amends with other people rather than with God. And I haven't always done an excellent job at that. So when I tried to extrapolate from what it looked like when I wronged someone else and tried to make things right to what it might look like to do that with God, I was kind of picturing that you just go and you say you're sorry for your sins and you're so embarrassed and it's so awkward that God forgives you, just like with another person, where you're just sorry enough at them that everyone just wants it to end and to move on. But what I was really moved by is that confession was very different from that. Confession exceeded apology and taught me what apology could be between people by experiencing it between me and God. Because when I go to confess my sins, I'm not just trying to move on or have a reset to where I was. It's not as though I want God to simply roll back the clock to who I was immediately before sinning and we can pretend the sin never happened. Because, of course, who I was before sinning was someone on the cusp of sin. It's not enough when I go to God to just say, I want things to be the way they were. Can we put this behind us and move on? Who I was isn't sufficient. I want more than that from God. I don't just want forgiveness. I want healing. I want strength. And so
Here, I'm listening here now.
the image that really spoke to me when I thought about what confession was a kind of pottery repair practiced in Japan called kintsugi, which is when a piece of pottery, a teacup, a plate is broken and you're trying to repair it. And you might think that what repair looks like is trying to fit the pieces back together as carefully as possible. Every last little piece, every grain that's broken off, every splinter pressed back in so that the seam is barely noticeable. The kind of fix you would do if your parents were out and you broke a vase while they were gone and you were trying to mend it all as seamlessly as possible. And then when you put it back, you turned the seam to the wall. So hopefully no one would know it had ever happened. And that's the kind of healing I pictured from confession, that God and I could get as close as possible to being able to pretend my sin had never existed. But in kintsugi, a potter takes a different approach to repair. Instead of using a clear glue to fit the pieces back together, they used a colored lacquer. In fact, they use a lacquer that has gold in it, so it shines, it's bright, it catches the light. And that's what lies along the seam. So it's impossible, even if you have every piece and even if they fit together very neatly, with kintsugi, it's impossible to tell the piece hasn't been broken. The act of mending calls attention to the places where it was mended. And when I thought about that, I had a better sense of what God is doing in the confessional. Because it isn't enough just to be put back together the way I am. And it isn't enough to want my sins to lie in my past ignored by me and God. What God does in confession, what he does in our prayer, is that he takes whatever we bring him, whatever is broken, whatever is flawed in it, and he not only mends it, he leaves his mark on the mending. Until when I go into the confessional, burdened by my sin, all I can see is the sin. But when I look back, even reflecting on my errors, with God's healing and confession, it's impossible for me to look at the break without seeing the shining line of his grace, illuminating it, marking the mending, so that even my wounds become a place where I see the evidence of God's love. Even the things that most embarrass me have God at their heart and at their root. And I see in that, the experience that the disciples had when they saw Christ resurrected, when they saw that his wounds were not healed as they might have expected, knowing he was alive. How could a living man, a man who ate fish with them, bear the marks of death? And they received something better than what they thought, because if Christ had appeared to them with his wounds gone, it would have been as though the crucifixion succeeded but was self-erasing. That God came back to us, that Christ came back to us unmarked, erasing what he had done. But in fact, they saw those marks of shame, those marks of pain could be transfigured into marks of glory. And it meant so much to me, preparing for confession, preparing my very small and pitiful acts of prayer to see that God takes what's worst in us, our sin, and limbs it with his love, so that there's nothing in our lives that if we offer it to him can't become a sign of his kingship, a sign of his love, and a sign of his fatherhood. A lot of what I've done in prayer has been learning to pray in smaller and smaller ways, not just praying a whole rosary, but having a moment of looking out at a sunset or looking at my daughters or passing a church and just thinking, here you are, Lord, here's what you are doing. Because my temptation as a convert and as someone who was approaching God initially intellectually was to only bring him my best. And obviously, I do want to do that. I want to bring him the first fruits of my life. I want to bring him every good thing in my life. But to some extent, the more I had that sense of, I want to bring God my best prayers, I want to bring him my spiritual insights, I want to bring him this very long novena, the more I was thinking, I'm giving God part of my life. I'm giving God all the best parts of my life, but the worst parts are for me and they're private and they're not for God because he doesn't want those parts. He couldn't handle them. Those parts are secret, or I'll wait to try and make them smaller till I only have best things. And what confession taught me is that God wants every single part of our lives because he can transfigure every single part of our lives. There's nothing we do, even our worst sins, that he doesn't want us to bring to him. And the only way those wounds stay wounds and stay unhealed and stay burdens is when they stay only ours. To some extent, whenever I keep my sins back, whenever I hold myself back from a prayer I'm not sure will be good enough for God, I'm lying to myself in two ways. I'm lying in saying that those things aren't God's already, that there's any part of my life or my choices that is done in isolation from him, that he's not aware of or doesn't care about, or that it's secret from him somehow. And I'm lying in another way. When I say I want to only bring God my best deeds, my best prayers, I'm imagining those things are purely mine, that I'm bringing them to him and he'll look at me in pride and say, you did that, Leah. That was very good praying and you did it all by yourself. I know those other things, go try and fix them and bring them back to me when they're all settled. But there's nothing in my life that isn't leavened by him already. There's nothing I do. My best prayers, my greatest moments are not my particular pride to bring him to show off. They're also the evidence of his action in my life. And if I'm grateful for his work there, all the more reason to bring him the smallest, humblest, and saddest moments of my life that I want to see him there. I want him to reach in and transfigure my wounds, my broken parts, my smaller prayers, my moments of doubt, that all of those are his and they're only fully mine, even so much as they are his. Everything I hold back from God becomes smaller, weaker, diminished because it has less of him in them, or really less of me acknowledging him in them. So to some extent, becoming a Christian, trying to enter this conversion of heart began for me as a problem of how to find God and how to make space for God, of how to go through the wardrobe and spend more time in Narnia and let that leaven my life back in the world. And actually living as a Christian means not so much clearing any space for God, but clearing other distractions that let me pretend God isn't already there. You know, Erasing the boundaries between the wardrobe and the world, between the church and the world, where I think this is my space for God and this is my space for me. And I'm so moved by what it is that God does when we bring him our smallest things. And in some ways it's more impressive than when we bring him our biggest triumphs, because the way he can transfigure smallness gives even greater voice to his glory. There's one story I really love by Corrie ten Boom, who wrote The Hiding Place, and she and her family hid Jews from the Nazis during World War II and were ultimately caught. She went to a camp. She and her sister were there. She survived. And after the war, she talked about giving speeches on trust and hope and forgiveness. And there was a moment when she was speaking when an officer came up to her from the camp who had had a conversion of heart. And he wanted to thank her for her prayers, for her witness. And he asked her, will you forgive me? And Corrie ten Boom is a spiritual giant, profoundly generous woman. And she looked at him and thought, I cannot do it. The space God was active in her life, even with all her preparation of love and forgiveness, was not a way where she felt prepared to forgive this man. Even though we might have looked at her from the outside and said, if anyone could do it, Corrie ten Boom could do it. She's prepared for that active spiritual gianthood that it would take to forgive this man who had persecuted her and her sister, but she couldn't. And she thought, Lord, what do you want me to do? I'm racking every bit of strength I have. I understand what I'm supposed to do, and I can't do this. And she thought, well, I can't forgive him. I don't know how. I don't have the strength. I don't have a way forward. She's like, but I can just do one thing, and I'm physically going to lift my hand. I can move my hand even if I can't move my heart. And so she lifted her hand to shake this man's hand, even though she knew she couldn't forgive him and didn't have it in her to do it. And when her hand touched his, she was suffused by God's power and grace, and real forgiveness filled her heart, something she knew she couldn't find in herself alone. And when I think about what I'm trying to do in prayer, it's less often the case that I'm trying to heave myself all the way to an act of spiritual gianthood, and more that I don't want to hold back any small thing I can offer God, any small thing that might be just the physical movement of my hand, the turning of my attention to him, because I don't know how he'll respond. And Corrie ten Boom didn't know how he would respond in that moment. She just said, well, I don't think I can give God what he's asking for, but let me give him whatever I have and see what he does with it. And when we bring whatever we're holding, our bodies, our sins, our doubts, our fears, our hesitations, God can transfigure those things. And it's by bringing those small things, by having that faith that God wants to work in every single part of our lives, that he's able to do even more with our best. But to some extent, as long as we bring God only our best in prayer, we're always holding part of our lives back from him. We're trying to set boundaries on where his glory can be made manifest, where his mercy can be shown, where we can experience his love. So as a convert, I've started through, the defined prayers of the church, the counseled, ways of praying, and I've tried to grow into a maturity, and I'm still trying, of just seeing how can each individual moment be God's? It already is. How do I know that? How do I remind myself moment by moment? And how, especially as someone who didn't grow up as a Christian, do I teach my girls that God isn't someone they're going to make space for? God isn't someone who they give part of their lives to. God is already there animating every moment of their life. And the only question is, do we bring it to him? Do we say, yes, please work here in this moment as I'm chopping things for dinner? Please work here in this moment while I'm stuck in a traffic jam. Please work here in this moment as I've just spoken to a friend in anger. Please work here. I know you're here. I know you're here as much as I know that you're in any moment of grace and joy and consolation. Please let me see your face here where I'm not looking for you, because I know that with the smallest yes, your yes comes roaring in like a waterfall if I'll just make the smallest hole in the dam. And that's been my challenge, because so much of my life has been things I'm proud of that I have done. And I think learning to pray is the question of where is my relationship with God not so much a matter of the things I'm doing, but the things I'm choosing not to do or choosing to ignore. And how can I make each of those quiet no's an enthusiastic yes? I'm still trying to live and learn in that answer, but I keep coming back to that example of dancing, where the more I practice the basic, the more I practice time with God, pliancy with God, the more I am able to be moved moment by moment. The more I'm able to see what small thing or large thing he might be asking for from me, if only I'm willing to hear it. And I'm not so stuck where I am or with my anticipation of what his plan is that I can't be moved when he calls.
Thank you, Leah. So just for question and answer period, if there's anybody with a question online, please raise your hand, and then I'll activate your I'll activate your camera and unmute you. Are there any questions in the hall? There's a lady here.
Thank you for your presence here today. We really appreciate it. I wanted to have some guidance about, I've just reading Bernie Sanders' books on revolution. And I know that in the 60s at university, we studied about the power of the corporations. But the power of the corporations now are that they pay no income tax, that they receive refunds from the tax department with creative accounting. They don't pay their workers. They use their workers. They don't have what one would call something to take care with their family, being equitable. So there seems to be at the moment so much inequity in our country, and it seems to be growing. It's in the States, but it's also in Canada. And of course, we haven't had any growth of the living class, of the middle class for decades. So as a Catholic, where is there guidance about how to think about that? Because reading Bernie Sanders' books, it's just so inequitable, and there just needs to be so much change in society. And I'm just wondering if you have any guidance about that.
I appreciate the question, and I think a powerful place of the Church's witness is that we ask for not only justice, but we ask for a fuller justice than often feels possible in politics, right? We ask for, not just some safeguards against financial abuses, but true generosity, even if we're not sure how people will grow to that level of virtue. I think there are a number of good writings throughout church history about how profound a generosity we're called to, that act as a real corrective against the idea that, you've done enough as long as your own company is profitable, as long as you're responsible to your shareholders. There's Rerum Novarum, which is about what it means to be a worker with dignity and how to treat workers in light of their dignity. But I find most powerful the writings of St. Basil the Great, one of the early church fathers, who was very stark in his description of what theft is as he understands it. And he says, the extra coat in your closet was stolen from the man that is poor, the extra shoes from the man who is shoeless. That there's a real extent to which, nothing in our lives is given to us by God except to be used in his service. So this question of when have we reached the end of our charity, when have we reached the end of what justice commands of us, is practically speaking almost never, because there's just nothing that we have that we can say, well, this part is just for me. God means this part just for me. Everything we have is meant to kind of flow out of our hands like water to people who need it. That doesn't quite answer every policy question of how do we constrain rapacious greed in others, but I think it's important both to address that on the policy level of law, but also as Christians to provide an example of deep generosity that goes beyond kind of what feels prudent even, so that when we ask for laws to change, it's clear we're living out what we're asking of others in our lives. And that, again, which like I talked about in the first question period, a lot of modern life is kind of a response to counsels of despair and assuming nothing better is possible. And I think offering a real sign of hope that something different is possible, that it's possible to, hold material possessions as not your own, that you're stewards of them and trust for others, and you're willing to let go of them when it's clear someone else needs them, is a really powerful witness for folks who feel that everything they have is precarious and they have to hold on tightly to what they have, to be generous and to take risks in generosity.
You speak with your students for political science and for governance. how do you talk to them? Like, and you also feel compelled that you need to talk to them.
I think a lot of the challenge is, offering a better witness in America than you get from either political party. So it's less a question of, you have the power to vote, which is an important power. But if you kind of think of your civic life as ending with making the best possible choice of the ballot box, you've left a lot out. So I really admire the witness of people who, and I point to the witness of people who, take risks and go beyond what either political party is offering them to live a life of greater generosity. And that might mean, in the United States, there are places where it's illegal to distribute food to the homeless, which is horrifying, right? So it means people who are both distributing the food and willing to get arrested for the sake of saying, our church will always welcome people. Our church will always distribute food. We never want anyone to stand between us and need. And they don't necessarily have anyone who's kind of agitating for that justice who's a politician. So it makes sure that you're both engaged politically where that's the smart thing to do, but that you don't let your political vision be narrowed to what the people running in your district are willing to offer.
Right. Thank you very much.
Do you have any other questions? I think my wife, Sheila, has a question.
Thank you, Ethan. I should have asked this after your last talk. I was mentioning it to him over lunch. Your friend Ben, who is an Anglican priest, how is your conversation with him go now that you're Catholic? And has he considered converting to Catholicism? And also the story of your husband, because I am Anglican, and Ethan and I have this discussion all the time.
Well, I pray for Ben a lot because I'm profoundly grateful for him. And I know he loves God so much, right? And because I love him and because I know he loves God, I pray for him to become Catholic because I want him to have the fullness of what God offers. And I'm really encouraged by the Anglican Ordinariate as a way for people who have really been shaped by the good work God has done in the Anglican Church to carry over some of those habits of prayer and community within the Catholic faith. So that's what I pray for Ben. And I'd ask all of you to pray for him. He's in Canada. I won't tell you his last name because I feel like that's not fair, but I think you can all pray for him yourself. And one of the things I'm really moved by is, he's someone who, we disagree about some things that divide the Anglican and Catholic churches, but he's also very unafraid to follow God in obedience, even when not everyone in the Anglican Church is doing it. So he's in Canada and he's been very outspoken about euthanasia in Canada at a time the institutional Anglican Church has not been. And so I really believe in the work God has done in Ben's life and the work he's done in my life through Ben, and that Ben loves God and wants to follow what he asks of him. And I'm hoping at some point that will be clear to him that that's the Catholic faith. But I find so much to admire in God's life in Ben and Ben's life in God is, I guess, the short of the answer there.
And then the second part, just how did your husband come to Catholicism, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so his family all came in together. They were Anglicans and they were in America, where there are a number of tensions in parts of the Anglican Church, which I imagine also hold in different parts of Canada. So they belonged to a very faithful parish that to a certain extent was being pushed by their less orthodox bishop. So they wound up kind of a little spiritually homeless, where they loved God, but were under a bishop who took a lot of their love for God as contemptible and was kind of very opposed to Anglo-Catholic practices. So he and his family kind of kept asking, why are we in this position of tension? Why is it that the bishop is against this, and are we wrong or is she wrong? And the more time they spent with it, then the more time they spent with church history, the more convinced they were that what they loved about Anglicanism was best expressed in the Catholic faith. So they became Catholic altogether. And then eventually most of their parish ultimately did become Catholic through the Anglican Ordinariate, but they came straight to Catholicism a little ahead of time. And then ultimately the Anglican bishop took their church away.
Thank you for that. Ethan says to me, well, you're basically Catholic, and I just have to get there if I'm going to get there.
Well, I will pray for you. I think the thing is, that nothing that's good that's given to us is taken away from us when we become Catholic, right? God just gives us more and more deeply. And I'm really grateful, especially as we raise our girls, for everything that my husband received in the Anglican Church, because it helps him be a good father to them, that he's had this long-standing friendship with God.
Thank you very much, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Malcolm has a question. Okay. Malcolm has a question. Good.
Thanks again for the great talk, and thanks for these really good questions. I could go down the politics route, but I won't. I was just wondering, I have 2 daughters as well. I tell people I'm Catholic. They often see an inherent conflict between sort of women, feminism, blah, 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 and Catholicism. So what kind of things, can you provide some insights on, Catholicism and women, and because certainly we know young women, like young men, are really getting a lot of mixed messages, to put it mildly.
I think one of the biggest challenges, and I'm someone who would describe myself as a feminist, though I possibly might disagree with other feminists on what true advocacy for women consists of. But I think one of the big challenges is, in the present day, women are often told that the way that we prove that we're equal to men is by being interchangeable with men. And that creates a lot of pressure, to essentially lie about who we are, so that we can be on an equal footing by pretending whatever makes us different is irrelevant or easily gotten overable. And you see a pattern of that particularly around children, I think, where, men and women getting the same amount of time off isn't quite true, even though it's important for both parents to take care of their baby, because women physically give birth and have to recover. A woman might continue breastfeeding, and even though a father loves his baby, his love takes a different form and makes different demands on him. And so you see a pattern of kind of ways that are meant to help women stay on an equal footing with men that are really about solving the problem of women being women. To the point where I think tools like a breast pump for women who are nursing can be useful, but in practice, they're often used to just make the woman more accessible to her boss, rather than to have more flexibility to use as she chooses for her family, her job, and her baby. So where I think the Catholic Church has a big truth to articulate that the modern world neglects is in saying women are equal in dignity to men without being identical or interchangeable with men. And it's really possible for there to be profound, meaningful difference and equality. I think, again, we talk about the different modern councils of despair. There's a fearfulness that if women and men are truly different, then one of them must be superior to the other. And the more you give any ground for a real difference, an insolvable difference to exist, the more you're conceding that someone, men or women, must be kind of bad at the root or less worthy than the other. And the church is very clear that men and women are both made in the image of God and distinct. And I think that's a very challenging idea in a society that thinks that equality is premised on identicality or on all differences being trivial. So that's where I think there's a great deal of hope in the Catholic Church for women, and a hope that's lacking elsewhere. I think for the most part, you see that lots of the demands made of women are unjust, which is something I think the feminist movement has done a good job of articulating. And in some ways, the Catholic Church is just expanding the list of unjust demands that are made, where it's unjust, to not pay women a fair wage for the same work, but it's also unjust to say to women, the price of your fair entrance to society, is abortion. That we can't see you as equal unless you are equally able to walk away from a baby as a man is not being physically connected to them. But lowering women to the worst vices of men and taking the vices of men as just the pattern for human life, as opposed to a diminution of who men are, also of seeing them as autonomous and not as fathers, as disconnected and not as loving or being willing to be depended on. That's a kind of a long answer, but it was a big question. I think what the church has to give women is the knowledge that we don't have to accept the world's view of us as defective men who have to remedy the deficiency to be treated as equal. We're equal as we are, and our differences are not something to be ashamed of or to work to cover up.
Malcolm's nodding. Thank you very much for that answer. Wonderful. I should add that Leah's Substack is called Other Feminisms, and it touches a lot on these topics. So that's a recommendation for everybody watching. Are there any other questions in the hall or online? I have a question related to raising your daughters in the faith. My wife is pregnant, and so we're expecting. Thank you. We're expecting a child, so I would appreciate your guidance on. I mean, obviously your children are very young, but what are some of the things that you're going through in terms of how to raise your children in the faith? Thank you.
All right. So again, my children are 1 and 3, so I only know so much about this. I think a big thing that was really valuable to me is a book called The Little Oratory, which is about having a space for prayer in your house. And just thinking about the ways that children learn from observing what we do as much as from explicit instruction. So, being attentive of not doing things like, let's save the prayer my husband and I do for after the girls are in bed when they can't interrupt us, versus, no, we want some of our family prayer to be visible to them, even if it's more chaotic with them there, so that they see what we do. And one of the pieces of advice that was in that book that I found so helpful is, it's tempting, especially for me, who, as you all know by this point, is a very talky person, to kind of show children things by narrating every part of it to them. So if I were doing a rosary, saying like, oh, and now we're going to the big bead, and now I'm going to do another prayer on the small bead. I'm still thinking about this mystery just to keep them present with me and make sure it's interesting to them the whole way through. And what the book said is, sometimes what children learn is that you are being quiet and reverent and attentive to something that's not them. And by doing that, they can look along you to what you are attentive to. And that cut very deeply against my inclinations, where my inclination is to be entertaining, to turn back towards them always. And so I guess one of the things I'm most attentive to is, even though I want to spend some time in explicit instruction, and even though I want to do some prayers with them that are specifically for them as small people, I also just want them to be able to be present and see me, being prayerful and reverent and silent and attentive, so that they have the opportunity to see that that's part of prayer and look along me to Christ. Now, in practice, at Mass, a lot of Mass is pretty chaotic for us with little girls who make breaks for the aisle, who climb up our bodies, right? But so what my husband and I really try and do is that we want to be attentive, silent, and facing forward at the consecration and the elevation. And no matter what else goes on in the pew, even if the girls are climbing all over each other, which, to be clear, they don't do every time, we're going to take our attention away from any of that chaos and put it on Christ when the priest is holding him up for us in the Eucharist. And we've explained a couple times to them that's what we're doing. But now we don't explain it every time in depth. All right, now we're being quiet. This is me being quiet and attentive. We just want to show it so that we can pray for the strength to be good parents, and they can see what that prayer looks like, and that they can see there are some things that kind of pierce our time together and reorient it in a different way than almost anything else we do together. So that's my advice so far, but feel free to ask me next year and in 5 years, and I think a lot of things will change in the different seasons of their lives.
That's helpful.
Actually, I guess the other thing I'd add is that children, like adults, are really fed by beauty. So it's even just like when we got Christmas cards, we save all the ones that have beautiful art, and then we let the girls hold them or play with them or put them all around the house, because we think they learn as much by just looking at images of Mary and baby Jesus or of the Holy Family as they do by us kind of explaining to them at this age.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Are there any other questions in the hall? Yep, John. Great. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Leah. I apologize. I couldn't see your presentation, your talk this morning. The Knights of Columbus had a basketball free throw that I was at. This question is.
Did you win?
The children all won, and that's the important thing.
Okay.
This question is probably more appropriate for the first talk. I've got a friend who was Catholic. He's now become an agnostic. He believes in God. He believes that there is a God, but he can't reconcile himself that this God is a loving and caring entity for all of us. So he has a hard time, A, believing it, and B, being loving towards this entity. He truly believes that it really does not care anything about us. It just, we both happen to coexist. What would you perhaps say about that, or might be an argument for him to reconsider in order to bring him back to the church?
That's a hard question. It depends a lot for each individual, and what are the things that feel like they're barriers to God for them, and what are the things that feel like, even when they're not strong enough, are still pulls towards God. Um, I think one thing that you can always say is, truthfully, if that's who God were, I'd join you in rejecting him, right? That you're not arguing about whether the God that he imagines is worth worshiping, because you don't think he is. Like, you just don't think that's who God is. So I think sometimes you can praise the good, even in someone who's rejecting part of the church, where when they mistake the church, you can say, yes, like, if that's who God were, if that's what the church was, I also wouldn't be Catholic, or I also wouldn't feel myself as, beloved by God. But where we disagree isn't whether that false God should be worshipped. We agree he shouldn't. We disagree about who he is. And here's why I believe who he is who he is. And, here's where I'm open to questions or open to hearing why you disagree. But I guess a lot of times in any disagreement, I want to focus on where the person I'm talking to is oriented towards truth. And it sounds like where your friend is oriented towards truth is he wouldn't settle for a God who's smaller than our actual God. And that's good. And the question is where he can kind of regain hope that a God who is really worthy of worship and who has the capacity for love and expresses it the way our God really does exists. But he's right to say he wouldn't settle for a small, pagan, competitive God.
Sounds like trying to enhance, to help him find where God truly loves him in the world. That sounds like the sort of the way to go. I never thought of admiring the fact that he wouldn't accept a God as he imagines it. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Well, I feel like there are people who are professed Christians who have accepted a God who's not that different from the God your friend is describing and rejecting. And there's also a profound tragedy in that, of kind of identifying as a Christian while making God small, or almost even, getting over the rough parts by excusing, well, God loves us, but he doesn't really engage in human life. Obviously he's too busy, but I'm a faithful Christian, but I don't think he listens to prayer. Prayer is for us to think about God, but he doesn't act on it. And you'll see people make God so small that he's not God anymore, while not thinking of themselves as not being Christians or as disrespecting them. But it's a way of making God small enough that there can't be any of those challenging moments I guess your friend has had. And, it's even harder because your friend knows he's not a Christian. And if things changed, he would be. Someone who thinks they're a Christian but keeps denying who the God is doesn't feel that sense of disconnect that they might actually want to heal.
True. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Take care.
I'll summarize it a little because I appreciate it. I appreciate that it looks like Marianne is saying that there's a group she works with in Winnipeg who helps and shares and lives with the material poor on Main Street, and that they need more volunteers. So it looks like she's asking folks to consider getting in contact with her if they're interested in doing this. It looks like it's called Chez Nous, Our Place. So I'll just highlight that for a second. She says specifically volunteers on Thursday morning from 8 a.m. to noon. So,
seeing God in kind of everyday life, but are there other, what's your preferred method of prayer? I'm assuming it's the rosary, and then what other methods of prayer would you recommend or that you've tried, etc.?
I think right now, honestly, it's the Chaplet of Divine Mercy for me, and the Divine Office. And one of the things I love about the Divine Office is that when I'm praying it, I'm always praying in concert with the church all over the world, and throughout time, since it repeats. So in some sense, when I'm praying a particular day of the Divine Office, I'm praying it in concert, not only with everyone praying it today, but with everyone who prayed it a year ago and everyone who prayed it 10 years ago. And I like that feeling of being swept up in the universal prayer of the church, even when I'm at home by myself. I also find it really beneficial because when I pray through the Psalms in the Divine Office, there are moments when the Psalm speaks directly to me, and there are moments when it doesn't at all. And I figure that that day God is asking me to pray for someone whose name and circumstances I don't know, for whom this is the exact right Psalm, who might be praying it alongside me somewhere else with the Divine Office, or who might not know to pray the Psalms or might not be a Christian. And so I love the Divine Office because it makes me feel really knit into the whole church on earth. So that's very high on my list personally.
Great, thank you very much. I think we're approaching time for a break. Unless there's any questions in the hall or online. Okay, I think it's time for a break, so we're going to take 30 minutes, and then we'll resume at 1:30 our time, and I think it's 12:30 your time. Thank you very much for the second presentation. We look forward to hearing from you again, and then the next presentation is on building Christian community, and it's related to your book, Building the Benedict Option.
That's right. I'll see you guys soon.
Great, thank you.